Nip it in the bud right then. Stop this family tree. They want to cut the tree down. And I want to know who in the world give these people the right to go and do these sort of things to another human being. You know, even in Germany, Hitler didn't have the right to do this. We're the ones that educated Hitler on this stuff here, sterilization.
What if I told you that one of the darkest ideologies in human history, Nazi Germany's racial purity doctrine, didn't start in Berlin, it started in America? Yes, decades before Hitler's rise to power, the United States was already experimenting with a dangerous idea. A vision of a perfect society, free of illness, poverty, and so-called weakness. The tool they chose? Eugenics. A pseudo-scientific belief that the human race could be improved by controlling who was allowed to have children and who wasn't. It wasn't some fringe theory. It wasn't whispered in secret. This was mainstream, funded by powerful institutions, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ivy League universities, backed by scientists, doctors, lawmakers. And it led to thousands of Americans being forcibly sterilized, locked away, labeled unfit, never allowed to have families, simply because of their race, their mental health, or their poverty. But the most chilling part? Adolf Hitler saw this and admired it. He studied American laws, he read American eugenics books, and he used them as a blueprint. What began in American laboratories and courtrooms would evolve into the horrors of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and the final solution. This is not just a story of Nazi evil. It's a story of how dangerous ideas can cross borders, and how history is never as distant as it seems. Let's go back to where it all began. To understand how Hitler was inspired, we first need to understand what eugenics actually is. Eugenics comes from a Greek word meaning well-born. It's the belief that the human population can, and should, be improved by controlling who is allowed to reproduce. In simple terms, it's the idea of breeding a better society by encouraging the fit to have children and preventing the unfit from doing so. In early 20th century America, this idea wasn't just popular, it was celebrated. Scientists, doctors, politicians, even religious leaders supported it. They believed eugenics could eliminate poverty, mental illness, and crime by stopping these traits from being passed on. And this wasn't some underground movement. It was funded and promoted by America's most powerful institutions, the Carnegie Institution, which established a dedicated research center for eugenics. The Rockefeller Foundation, which poured money into genetic studies. Ivy League universities, where professors lectured on the science of racial hierarchy. High school textbooks taught eugenics as fact. County fairs held fitter family contests, judging people like livestock. Soon, laws began to follow the science. By the 1920s, dozens of U.S. states had passed sterilization laws. Tens of thousands were forced into surgery, many without knowing why. And to the public? It was all done in the name of progress. But this progress had a dark future, one that would stretch across the Atlantic and turn deadly. So who were the people that eugenicists believed should not be allowed to reproduce? They called them undesirables, a cold, clinical term that masked devastating human consequences. In reality, these were society's most vulnerable and marginalized. People with disabilities were among the first to be targeted. Mental illness, physical deformities, epilepsy. Any condition considered hereditary was grounds for forced sterilization. Next came the poor. If a family relied on public assistance or lived in poverty, they were seen as genetically unfit, as if being born poor was a crime, passed down like a disease. Immigrants, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe, were labeled less evolved, racially inferior to Northern Europeans. Many faced intense discrimination. Not for anything they had done, but for where they came from. Then there were black and brown communities. In many southern states, black women were sterilized without consent, sometimes without even knowing it had been done. It was called the Mississippi appendectomy. Doctors told them they were getting routine procedures, but they left unable to ever have children again. Even young girls in state-run homes were sterilized if they were seen as promiscuous or feeble-minded. They were given no choice, no trial, no defense. Just a label and a surgery. Thousands of lives were altered forever, in silence, in shame, and most of all, in the name of a lie. Because this wasn't about science. It was about control.
And sterilized me without my knowledge. Because I was black, poor, and my mother was in a prison. My dad was running around. He was an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. So they automatically assumed that I was going to become an alcoholic. And then, without even my son as a baby, automatically assuming that he was the third generation and that he was going to be an alcoholic also. What they wanted to do was nip it in the bud right then. Stop this family tree. They want to cut the tree down. And I want to know who in the world give these people the right to go and do these sort of things to another human being. You know, even in Germany, Hitler didn't have the right to do this. We're the ones that educated Hitler on this stuff here, sterilization.
The silent war in America had already sterilized tens of thousands, quietly, legally, and efficiently. And overseas, someone was watching: Adolf Hitler. Long before he came to power, Hitler was studying America's eugenics movement with great interest. He saw something terrifyingly useful: a modern, democratic society using science and law to eliminate the undesirable. Hitler openly praised American sterilization laws, calling them a model for what he hoped to build in Germany. He admired the way the U.S. had categorized people by race, intelligence, and fitness, and had turned those ideas into action. And he read American eugenics literature obsessively. One of his favorite books, The Passing of the Great Race, by American eugenicist Madison Grant. In it, Grant warns of the decline of the white race and calls for strict racial separation and selective breeding. Hitler didn't just agree, he called the book his Bible. Then there was Harry H. Laughlin, an American scientist who developed sterilization policies used in the U.S. The Nazis were so impressed by his work, they awarded him an honorary doctorate from a German university. This wasn't some fringe alliance. American policies, American books, and American scientists gave Hitler the blueprint he needed. The ideas that started in U.S. courtrooms and hospitals would soon echo in Nazi death camps, because what began as scientific progress in America became the foundation for genocide in Europe.
The Germans took inspiration from the American law and from Buck v. Bell in establishing their own sterilization law.
The law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring was passed on the 14th of July, 1933. Conditions such as mentally disturbed, schizophrenia, depressed, deaf, disabled, alcoholics were targeted by the law. Tribunals on hereditary health were set up composed of 2 doctors and a judge. Under the Nazi regime, they carried out the forced sterilization of 400,000 people.
The blueprint had been laid. What began in U.S. institutions, sterilizations, racial classifications, forced segregation, was now crossing the Atlantic into the darkest chapter of modern history. Inspired by American eugenics, Hitler and the Nazis pushed the ideology further, from controlling birth to controlling death. It started with forced sterilizations in Germany, just like in the U.S. Then came mercy killings of the disabled, the sick, and those deemed unfit. They called it Action T4, a secret Nazi program to eliminate people with disabilities. It mirrored the same logic America had used: purify society, remove the weak, protect the bloodline. But it didn't stop there. The racial theories promoted in American universities were now being weaponized in Nazi concentration camps. Jews, Roma, Gypsies, people with disabilities, and countless others were no longer just seen as undesirable. They were enemies of the state, subhuman, to be eradicated. The Holocaust was not born overnight. It was the final chapter in a long chain of scientific justifications, bureaucratic procedures, and legal precedents, many of which had roots in American soil. American science gave the Nazis intellectual cover. American laws gave them structural inspiration. And American silence, for a time, gave them confidence. This wasn't just a German tragedy. It was a human tragedy, seeded, in part, by ideas that came from the land of the free.
The Holocaust, one of history's greatest crimes, didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with ideas. Ideas born in laboratories, classrooms, and courtrooms on both sides of the Atlantic. As we saw in the last section, American eugenics didn't just influence Nazi Germany, it empowered it.
Among other things. When Hitler was elected in 1933 in a free election, one of his slogans was, "All politics is applied biology." Okay? And that's the red light that one has to see on the road and not go down that road, ever.
Had said, "Tell me, why have you been chosen for this forced sterilization?" I looked at him. Still today, I don't know why. I still don't know why. All of that because of the outcome of a wrong treatment. I couldn't say the difference between a stream and a river, between a ladder and stairs. That was enough cause to sterilize a child. Up until today, I have never understood why.
Have you heard about the story of eugenics or things like that? No? Nothing? Okay, thank you.
I don't really know anything about it.
No?
No.
Have you heard something?
I have heard something on the news, but...
So here's the haunting question. Why don't we learn this part of the story in school? Why are the connections between American science and Nazi policy so rarely mentioned in textbooks? Is it discomfort? Denial? A fear of tarnishing a national image built on freedom and progress? It's easier to point the finger at Germany than to admit the rot began at home. But history doesn't care about comfort. It demands truth. Selective memory is dangerous. When we erase the past, we risk repeating it in new forms. Forced control of people's bodies. Racial discrimination disguised as policy. And the use of science to justify cruelty. Many of the same institutions that once championed eugenics still exist today. Universities, foundations, government agencies. Some have acknowledged their role. Most have not. But we don't study history to assign blame. We study it to understand how it happened and why it matters now. Because this isn't just about the past. It's about us. What we remember, what we ignore, and what we choose to do next. If this story challenged what you thought you knew, don't look away. Because silence is how history repeats itself. The people who were sterilized without consent, who were locked away, who were treated as less than human, many never had the chance to tell their story. But you can help change that. Share this video. Leave a comment. Tell us what you learned, what surprised you, what questions you're still asking. And hit that subscribe button and the bell so you don't miss the next story history tried to bury.